Hi, I'm Professor Green, and today we'll be talking about Chapter 6, Critical Thinking from the Public Speaking Project. Let's go ahead and get started. So this is a lengthy chapter, but so worthwhile. This is the difference between high school and college, right? I always like to tell the story that when my mom went back to get her undergraduate degree in her 40s, she had to take a test on critical thinking because they needed to make sure that she was able to think critically when she got to college, right? And so this is the difference between just accepting information, but really questioning information that you're getting. So let's go ahead and hop into it. There are five or so major areas of this chapter. The first one is critical thinking as an introduction, the big picture. Then we'll talk about logic and the role of the argument. Then we'll talk about understanding fallacies, both formal and informal fallacies. Let's go ahead and start with critical thinking. So here we go. Critical thinking is making sense of messages and determining which are true, which are probable, and which are intended. We evaluate arguments presented to determine if the logic is sound or if they rely on what are called fallacies or falsehoods to build their case. So what does all this mean? Let's hop into it. There'll be four sections to this introduction. The first one is critical thinking defined. Critical thinking defined. There are lots of different opinions on what critical thinking is, and the book chooses two major authors. The first one is John Dewey. He says that critical thinking is active and done by choice. And right, that's true. Just like active listening, as opposed to hearing, we have to actively engage in thinking critically. We can't just sit there. We have to actually start to think. We have to analyze. We have to think strategically. So you have to decide that you're going to think critically. The next thing is by Barry Beyer. He says that thinking critically is making reasoned judgments. It's rationalizing and justifying your conclusions. So maybe now the wheels are starting to turn. Who does this type of work? Who thinks critically for their profession? Lots of different people, right? Lawyers especially, right? When they go into the courtroom, they're trying to prove a point and trying to make the judge and the people who are making the decision to really think about it. And the lawyer is trying to look between the lines, read between the lines and come up with a case for their client. Another person who does this, before we get on to point number 3, is a business analyst. And for about 10 years, I worked in large banks as an analyst. And I was hired to go into different parts of the banks and really question how efficient the management was. I was in a group called Efficiency Management, actually. And the best example that I always give is that I was in a strategy group, but I went into the part of the bank that processed checks, right? When you handwrite a check, I happen to have here right with me. So you write a check, right? And that then goes to a processing plant and they read the check, right? They read the number at the bottom with a machine. But often the machine can't read the numbers are not scribbled, but there might be a line through it, or the check is crumbled or something like this. So it'll go to an actual person to actually manually enter those numbers. And so my job was to go through and start interviewing the people who did that and see if we could make that process more efficient. Was she too far from the machine? Was the system that she was using to input that data, was that effective? Was it too slow? Could she have done that a little bit more quickly? So I spent probably about 8 weeks at this plant in Delaware and also in upstate New York, looking at these processes. And at the end of the day, I was paid to give the managers recommendations on how they could make their operations much more efficient. So not a very exciting or sexy job, I'd say, but super interesting, right? And it all goes back to critically thinking about, in this case, check handling. So now hopping on to our third point here, all about questioning everything that confronts us, including ourselves and our own biases, right? So I couldn't go in there and saying, checks are a waste of time. I hate checks, right? Why don't we just all do this electronically with Venmo? Well, that wouldn't work, right? Because they still process checks. Critical thinking defined. Number four, are messages well supported? Is the logic sound or flawed? Right? And so we also want to question, as we hear our speeches from our colleagues, is the message, does it make sense? Right? If she's saying we should save the planet, does it really make sense to use straws, not straws, paper straws, plastic straws? Right? We're still questioning this process. So that's all about thinking critically. Let's go into critical thinking skills. So what skills did I have to make me become an analyst? We have two slides on here. The first one is that I have really good listening skills, right? So as we spoke about in chapter 4, it's all about listening and paying attention and reading between the lines. Then I have really good analysis skills. So taking that information and manipulating that. So really understanding, when the person says that she's, processing this check, right? What is she really saying? Is she saying that she gets distracted when she goes to pick up the checks because someone is having lunch or someone is talking to her or her manager is giving her different information? So I really had to analyze that information, and then I had to evaluate that and give my recommendations, as I mentioned, to the manager. So these three skills are super, super important. So the book says listening, focusing on what and what is not being said, block out noise and distraction. We often are thinking of our response already when the person is speaking, right? We spoke about that a lot here in chapter 4. So really staying present and in the moment and not thinking about what we're going to have for lunch later or what we need to do after class today, really staying here. Analysis. This is considering the message in greater detail, laying out parts for further consideration, right? And so that's what I had to do. When I was an analyst, I would have a spreadsheet that was probably, when he printed it out, was probably between 40 and 60 pages long. And it's because I was working in Excel and documenting every 15 minutes with that person who was writing and processing that check, what she was doing actually, in major points by 15 minutes and breaking it down into every 15 seconds. So I was taking that information, then saying, okay, in this 15 seconds, she's doing this. And then 5 minutes later, in this 15 seconds, she's doing that. And then evaluation, right? So here we talk about assessing various claims, asking questions about what is being said and who is saying it, right? Is her manager giving her information? Is her subordinate giving her information? Maybe that's not correct. Is this, and when you're listening to people, is the speaker credible? Do they have resources? Does it ring true or false based on common sense? Does it hold up to scrutiny? What objections are raised by the message? How will further information affect the message? Will further information strengthen or weaken the claim? What objections are raised by the claim? So we'll talk about this further in this chapter. Let's get further into it. Great. So now we're going to talk about more critical thinking skills. This is continued, right? So we break it down into two here. Inference, consider evidence and claims together, reassembling the components, looking at evidence, alternative, and possible conclusion. Is the evidence sound, contradictory, from a credible source? Again, we talked about credible sources, right? In this class, you will be bringing sources to your speeches, to your last two speeches. And we're going to have at least 10 sources because we want to make sure that you've done your research, that you've gone out, you've spoken to people, that you've done some reading about what it is that you're talking about. And then self-regulation, that's also a huge critical thinking skill that we spoke about already in this course, right? Our pre-existing thoughts and biases, right? So if I don't like checks, I have to know, I can still analyze the situation, but I have to be aware that I don't like checks, and I have to block out that bias, and I have to say, today I'm just focusing on checks. The checks processing, doesn't matter what else I think about that, right? Or if I'm listening to a speech that's pro-life and I'm pro-choice, I can't think about my pro-choice options or what I believe, but I'm just listening to the person who's speaking about pro-life, right? So again, really, really important, right? when a lawyer chooses people to judge the case, right? He's looking for people who are not biased, right? They don't have any pre-existing thoughts or biases. Good. So now we're going to go into some uh, the critical thinking traits. Great. So the first one is, as we spoke about, again, open-mindedness, right? Receptive to all ideas. We're not focusing on one thing or another. We're analytic by nature. We ask questions and I dissect components, right? As when I did my analysis with these bankers, I would sit with them for probably 4 hours at a time and I would ask questions and really dissect what it is that they were talking about. This was systematic by method. Avoid jumping to conclusions, so don't already say what you think. You're inquisitive. You take action to learn more. You're judicious. You don't jump on the bandwagon of common thought. Really, really important, especially with social media and all this pressure and all these biased places. We can very easily be caught in common thought. We don't want to jump on the bandwagon. We don't want to get caught in what's called groupthink, which we'll talk about as well in this course. We want to be truth-seeking ethos, right? So what that means is we're going to search for the truth and we're going to be ethical about that, right? And then the last thing is confident in reasoning. So we want to believe in the logic, believe in the power of logic and letting others draw their own conclusions, right? And so we want to present the logic and then we want to let others make the conclusions on their own, right? That's the most powerful way to be persuasive, right? Don't say you should buy product XYZ. You should present them with the facts, right? You need to, let's say you're convincing them to buy a certain pan for cooking. Say you need to cook. Your pans are, not good quality. You're going to be cooking this type of food, etc. You're going to be cooking for large amounts of people. And then at the end, and say, and I have this pan to offer, right? They're going to want to buy your pan because you've lined up all the logic. Great. Let's go ahead and hop into the next slide. Again, back to where we started. We've talked about now critical thinking defined, critical thinking skills, critical thinking traits. Now we're going to hop into the value of critical thinking. Why do we want to do this? Well, okay, they pay you big bucks to do this, right? To become a lawyer. Even doctors do this. Everybody, who goes to graduate school will all do a lot of critical thinking. As for me, right, I have an MBA and I have a master's in communications. And so when I was being paid as an analyst, that you start somewhere around $160,000 a year to do this type of work, right? So it helps us formulate strong arguments for our speeches. And then it's another tool to help us create great speeches. So not only is this valuable in the workplace, but here in public speaking as well. So when you create your own speeches and when you listen to speeches, so valuable. And again, you'll be listening to speeches, especially with election years, you'll be listening to people campaigning. You really want to question what it is that they're saying. Okay, so that is what critical thinking is. Let's now roll into logic and the role of the argument. Great. So now we're going to talk about logic and the role of arguments. So we're going to talk through defining arguments, defining what's called deduction, giving you some examples of deduction, defining induction, and then some examples of induction. Let's go ahead and get started. So always when we're listening to arguments, right, intuition often tells us where there's a fallacy. So for example that they give in the book, right, if you buy a product like a supplement of some sort, then you'll be thin, right? The logic says not necessarily, right? There's no magic product out there that makes you thin. Getting thin is a whole different thing about working out, eating right, drinking lots of water, etc., and not just one particular product. So studying logic helps us to formulate stronger arguments. So we'll see this again and again as we go through our defining of arguments and induction and deduction. Defining arguments. So an argument, this is not a conflict, right? Sometimes we talk about arguments being a fight. This is not what that is here when we talk about critical thinking and logic. Here, what we're doing is we're using evidence and less assumption. And the example that they give in the book for this type of argument is Harrison and Sydney are sharing the cleaning of the bathroom, and girls are better than cleaning than boys, right? And Sydney's a girl. So therefore, Sydney should clean the bathroom, right? I don't know if that's true or not. Let's continue. So that's an example of an argument. Let's hop into defining deduction. An argument in which the truth of its premise guarantees the truth of its conclusions. It must be impossible for the premises to be true and for the conclusion to be false. And here we're moving from a general premise to a specific premise. And if either of these first two premises isn't true, then the entire argument is false. So going back to an example of deduction, right? So the United States should invade any countries holding weapons of mass destruction. According to our experts, Iraq has weapons of mass destruction. Therefore, we should invade Iraq. Not necessarily true. This is what they call deduction, right? It could be true, but again, we need to really question a little bit more. So let's go on and talk about what's called induction instead of deduction. Induction moves from specific to general. The truth of its proposition lends support to the conclusion. We analyze the arguments for strength and not the truth of the premises, as in deductive reasoning. And this may include extra information, so there's really no standard format. There's no flow like we just saw that with that example of an Iraq, right? Okay, so going back to the example of Sydney and Harrison, right? Now we're getting more information, right? The bathroom responsibilities alternate weekly. That's a general house rule. Sydney cleaned the bathroom last week. Actually, that's some evidence. We know that that's a fact, right? The chart indicates that it's Harrison's turn, another piece of evidence. Therefore now, Harrison, actually not Sydney, should clean. The argument is strong, but we still really don't know if it's true, because there could be other factors that Sydney has left out. For example, maybe she traded chores for something else, right? So now we're really questioning, right? Who should be cleaning, Sydney or Harrison? So going back to the role of arguments, right? Intuition often tells us when there's a fallacy. Studying logic helps us to formulate longer arguments, right? So the logic, right? The intuition, right? Is this true? Is this not? So now another example of induction. All terrorists were Muslim. The terrorists hate America. Therefore, all Muslims hate America. Right? So not necessarily true, right? It's important to practice self-regulation and not get caught up in personal biases, right? So obviously not all Muslims hate America, right? So that's not true. And also, as we said here, it's so important not to remember that, maybe we think something about Muslims, or maybe we think something about America, or maybe we think something about terrorists. So really questioning what that logic is. Great, so let's go hop into what are called fallacies. This is a flaw in or error in reasoning. This causes the conclusions to be invalid. In a deductive argument, right, which we spoke about initially, the fallacy makes it invalid, right? Because that means that the first two premises have to be true for the conclusion to be true. So one fallacy makes it totally invalid. But in an inductive argument, the fallacy just weakens the argument, right? Because there's arguments coming in from all different directions, and it's not in inductive reasoning. The conclusion is not based on the first two premises being true. Let's go ahead and talk about what fallacies are. There are formal and informal fallacies. Fallacies are defined by critically examining the structure of the argument exclusive of the individual statements. So the first one is the bad reasons fallacy. So the conclusion is assumed to be bad because the arguments are bad. This is seen in debates. So the example that they give for the bad reason fallacy, right? The new employee is too quiet and has no sense of style. We should fire him, right? I don't know. Should we fire him or not? It really depends, right? If he works at Subway, doesn't really matter if he's quiet, doesn't really matter if he has a sense of style, right? He doesn't really need to speak up. He's not selling anything. He's just making sandwiches and he's wearing a uniform. So that's a bad reason fallacy. If he's working at H&M, maybe we should think about that. A masked man fallacy. Here is a substitution of parties. If two things we substitute are identical, then the argument is valid. So this argument here is valid. Rosamond Smith wrote the book Nemesis. Rosamond Smith is an alias for Joyce Carol Oates. That means that Joyce Carol Oates wrote the book Nemesis. So that's true. The last formal fallacy is the fallacy of quantitative logic. Focus is on the use of some sort of quantifying word, such as all or some. Here's the example: all philosophers are wise. Really? All are philosophers wise? I'm not sure. If you go to law school, you will spend weeks and months and years studying these fallacies. For this course, you don't need to know them, but there will be a quiz on what these are, so I highly suggest getting to know them. And if you're thinking about going into law, then definitely. Okay, now we're going to talk about the informal fallacies, but there's so many of them, it takes up 3 different slides. So we break them into 3 different sections. First one is accident fallacy. This is a sweeping generalization. All dogs are good pets. Not necessarily, right? Some dogs, not such a good pet, right? If they pee and poop in the house and bark all the time, that might be a more difficult pet. A genetic fallacy. This is a focus on the individual making the argument when we connect the truth of a proposition to the person asserting it. So for example, my opponent has trait X, therefore she's not qualified to do the job, right? So similar to the one we saw before. So if my opponent has no sense of style, she's not qualified to work at Subway. Not necessarily the truth, right? A fallacy of ambiguity. When a term has more than one meaning, example, we won't be safe until we win the war on terrorism. What is safe? What is terrorism? That has really come into question in these COVID times, right? Before we thought of terrorism as bombs and September 11th, but now we think of terrorism as healthcare, as medicine, right? COVID is a sort of terrorism, or can be thought of one. The next one are fallacies of appeal. Appeals to authority. So truth is guaranteed because of the opinion of a famous person. So advertisements, right? When you see Jennifer Aniston advertising for Smart Water, right? Really question, right? I don't know if she's smart. Should you drink the water because she's drinking the water? I don't know. Next one is appeals to emotion, highly emotive or charged language. This is something like radical feminist, right? So a radical feminist is like, really excited and yelling and, has very charged language. She's appealing to your emotions, right? But should you be following her? Really question, she's excited, but are the issues that she's excited about, should you be excited about them too? Really question that. Appeals to ignorance, lack of evidence. So the examples that they give in the book, right? If you're unsure if ghosts are real, so they must be, right? If you don't know, then it's true. And appeals to pity. So points out unfortunate consequences that will fall upon the speaker. So for example, the student missing class, the student is missing class, and then the team will lose if he fails, right? So if you're doing a group project and the student's not coming to class and he's falling behind, then maybe the whole group is going to fail. Not necessarily true, right? Typically, the teacher evaluates you as individuals. Okay, so let's go into the second section of informal fallacies, right? We're almost done here. So, begging the question, petitio principii, a circular reasoning that occurs when the conclusion of the argument is used as one of the premises. For example, murder is morally wrong, abortion is murder, therefore abortion is morally wrong. So, is abortion truly murder? Right? So, this is, right, a circular reasoning. So, we have to really question if this is true or not. Okay. A black and white fallacy. This is either or. So this is where there are more than two alternatives exist, but only two are given, right? So again, going back to this abortion issue, right? Pro-life is not against choice, right? People think that pro-life advocates think that women should not have a choice, and that's not true. Pro-life is all about giving the fetus an opportunity, right? Pro-lifers say that women do have a choice. They have a choice. They can have the baby and keep it. They can have the baby and give it up for adoption. They can do lots of different things. So they're giving the women the choice. They're just saying that the fetus has life already and they don't want that fetus to die. Here we talk about the fallacy of composition. If all the parts have a given quality, then the whole of the parts will have it as well. So an example here, all the players are fast and are winners. Thus, the team is a winner. Not necessarily, right? That's why they talk about group dynamics, working as a group, right? You need to be not just individuals successful, but you need to be able to work together. Okay, and then the last one for the second section is fallacy of division. When we think the parts of the whole contain the same quality as the whole, right? For those of you who have ever baked anything, this is a great example. Muffins taste so good, so individual ingredients also taste good, right? What goes into muffins? Flour, bleh. Butter, right? Baking soda, baking powder, bleh. That all tastes really gross, right? Even when you put together all the ingredients and you taste the batter, very often even the batter doesn't taste good. It's only when you bake it and bring it together do the muffins taste really, really good. So that's the fallacy of division. Okay, our last slide on informal fallacies. And these informal fallacies are, the definition of informal fallacies are an error in reasoning, identified through analysis of the content of the premises, not through examining the structure of the argument like formal fallacies, right? So hopefully that's making more sense now. And I had to break down the 3 informal fallacies into 3 slides because there just wasn't enough space on one slide, but there's no prioritization between all of these informal fallacies. Let's hop into the last few. So non-causa, non-causa pro causa fallacy. This is accidental or coincidental connection. So the example here, going out into the rain causes one to get sick. Not necessarily, right? So you might be going out and you might get sick, but it may be because your immune system was down, you didn't take enough vitamin C, it was cold outside, you didn't use the right clothing, etc., etc. Okay, the next one, the red herring fallacy. This happens again and again and again, right? The red herring is something thrown in to distract you, right? So it's an irrelevant issue. The example here is John Kerry's wife was heir to the Heinz ketchup fortune, and thus he was an elitist, right? So not necessarily true. John Kerry, he just married into that family. He had a very grounded, actually, upbringing. Also, who knows if the Heinz family were elitists? Maybe some of them were, maybe some of them weren't. So we really need to question, is this logic true? A slippery slope fallacy, when we assume one action will initiate a chain of events later, right? Mothers are really good at the slippery slope fallacy, right? There are many probabilities that can happen, right? Your mom says, don't go to that motorcycle rally because it's going to be dirty, and then or you're going to start riding one of the motorcycles and then it's going to fall and you're going to hurt yourself and you're going to break your leg, or your rug's going to fall off and then you're going to go to the emergency room. oh my gosh. So you go down this huge slippery slope of what's going to happen, when actually we should just be in the moment and not make any assumptions. Okay. And then the last two. First, we have the straw man fallacy, when the actual argument appears to be refuted, but in reality is a related point. In reality, a related point is addressed here. So the example here is Obama cannot truly have American interests in mind because he is not truly American, but Muslim, right? So that's not true, right? Because Muslims are Americans too. And for those of you who don't know what a straw man is, right? A straw man is a doll made out of straw that is put in front of a farm. A lot of us who live in Los Angeles don't even know what farms look like, but the straw man sits in front of the farm to scare off the birds. So in this straw man fallacy, it's all about distracting you to go in a different direction, right? So we're trying to pull your attention in logic in someplace else so that you don't actually see the value of the argument. Okay, and then we see the weak analogy fallacy, poor connection between examples. Example A and example B are similar. A has characteristic X, and therefore B has characteristic X too. But are A and B, are they the same? They are similar, but they are not necessarily the same. So it's a weak analogy. Okay, those are informal fallacies, and that is the end of our section here for critical thinking. Please let me know if you have any questions. Thank you so much for joining our class today. Again, I'm Professor Green, and this is Public Speaking, and we're talking from the Public Speaking Project.org, Chapter 6.